Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. These webinar series deliver topics pertinent to beef, sheep, and goat producers. My name is Hilary, and I work for the webinar coordinator's home circuit. Tonight, we welcome back Professor Bruce Allworth, who's going to be talking to us about the best age to wean prime lambs. Just a bit of housekeeping to start with. This control panel will be at the top right-hand corner of your screen. The red arrow at the top left-hand corner of the control panel collapses and reinstates the control panel if you want to get a better look at your presentation tonight. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. Please type your questions in the question box provided. Please make these questions as succinct as possible, and I will relay them to Bruce at the end of the webinar. Just while we're here, I will also note that these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website at a later date. To introduce tonight's presenter, again we have Professor Bruce Allworth. Bruce graduated from Vet Science from Sydney University in 1984 and after that worked at Massey University in New Zealand. Bruce has worked at the McKinnon Project and has owned and operated a sheep and beef cattle consultancy business based in southern New South Wales and Victoria for 25 years. Bruce is currently a director of the Fred Morley Centre and Professor of Livestock Systems at Wagga's Charles Sturt University. Bruce also operates his own family farm at Holbrook. Okay, I will hand over to Bruce and he will get started with tonight's webinar.
Thanks, Hilary. So I should be able to share my screen.
Just got your email up there, Bruce.
Yeah, so I need to share the other one.
Yeah, so if you go up to the top of your
show screen, got it, and that's the main monitor, and that's number 3. Okay, so excellent. Now you should be looking at the best age to wean prime lambs.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce.
And that should have slipped over to the introduction. Are we right there, Hilary?
Yep. Sorry, buddy, in there. Looks good. Thank you.
That's great. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks everyone for joining. A particular welcome. I got a text from somebody in Uruguay, Sergio. So hi, Sergio. Welcome to the webinar from all the way from Uruguay. So tonight we're going to be talking about the best age to wean prime lambs. And the specific questions I've been asked is when to use cease lactation? Is 14 weeks still the best option for weaning if you lamb in July? And what are the factors to consider when determining your weaning date? So that's going to guide us, but I'd welcome any questions at the end of this on any issues you have around weaning. We're specifically looking at prime lambs for this webinar. So I guess the very first thing is, and what I really want you to do is think about your own enterprise and have a think about why you actually want to wean lambs. Because in actual fact, the lambs naturally wean themselves over time, and the milk production in the ewe as that lamb weans itself naturally does decrease. So there's no specific reason why we need to wean lambs. But there are 3 critical reasons why, as good managers, we need to wean lambs. And one is to give the lamb better nutrition. The other one is to get weight back on the ewe, and that's really important for next year's lambing. And the third reason will be worm control, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So I guess the main thing to think about is work out why you're weaning, and that will determine what the right time in your system it is to wean the lambs. And there's an interaction here between the time you're lambing and pasture availability. So I'm not actually going to come out with a specific day that you ought to be weaning your lambs. It will depend on your system. What I want you to do is just work through with me the parameters that we need to use and then apply it for your flock. But in actual fact, age is probably the only thing that's not a determinant of weaning as such. although we all tend to wean at a certain age, but that's because other factors are in play, which I'll explain. So I just want to touch on lactation, and I'm sure you've all seen a lactation curve before. The lactation is determined by the condition score of the ewe, how much pasture is available, the number of lambs that the ewe is suckling, and of course the genotype of the ewe, with some ewes being having much better lactation than others. Just by comparison, and I've tried to put them on the same line, even though Excel wouldn't allow me to do that. On the right-hand side here, I've got on the smaller graph where the red line rises up to the 12. That's the predicted lactation curve for merinos. And over here, we've got the lactation curve for first cross ewes. And given that it's the area under the curve that's the amount of milk produced, you can see that the crossbred ewes have much better milk production. However, what's important to note is that the shape of the curve is very similar in all the sheep. And the other thing that's important to note is that this peak lactation is much higher for ewes that are lactating with twins, but it's also not double the level. So even though ewes with twins are producing a lot more milk, the twins are actually getting less milk per head than the single lambs. And as you're all very well aware, that's the main reason why the single lambs grow at a faster rate in almost every trial anyone's looked at than twin lambs. But I'm sure you're all aware of that. The peak lactation is determined by the condition of the ewes and the pasture availability, and it may not reach as high as that if the ewes start in poorer condition. And in fact, if the ewes are on very poor feed and they start in poor condition, their lactation curve might start off and basically head downhill the whole time. If you have that situation, you're going to have to be weaning a lot earlier than in the situation where you're getting very good milk production. So I think that probably shows most of the data on that slide. The other thing to remember with lactation is milk is not free. It comes at quite a cost. It's actually a very efficient way of providing a high level of nutrition, but it is certainly not free. You'll see this graph in figure 3 at the top shows how ewes in lactation increase their feed intake. This doesn't happen in late pregnancy, by the way, which is why we tend to get preg tox. But during lactation, as the feed demand goes up, sheep actually eat more, and provided that feed is available, then the lactation curve will follow the sort of curve that I was showing you earlier in the last slide. There is, at the same time, there's decreased wool production. That's probably less important in crossbred sheep, but is still having an influence. So while ewes are milking, they're diverting their nutrients into the milk and they're producing wool far less efficiently. And they're also tending to not be able to gain weight or even lose weight while they're milking. So given that those things are happening, you need to be aware of those and see what implication they have in your flock. The important thing is that to get a decent supply of milk, you need adequate feed and the ewes need to be in reasonable condition, or you won't get such a high peak and the ewes will stop milking. As you can see from this red and blue curve, the ewes don't just suddenly stop milking, it tails off as you'd expect. And so that's important as well. There's no magic date that suddenly the ewe stops milking. So what are the implications of all this in terms of weaning? And I guess the most important thing is that as the lambs grow, their lamb weight increases, and lambs are generally growing around 300 grams a day while they're on their mothers. Certainly well over 200 grams a day for most lambs that you'll have. As those lambs get bigger, their energy requirements increase. So initially that works well with the milk consumed and the milk production goes up. But once you reach peak lactation and start to go down the other side, milk is no longer providing all the energies that is required and the lambs start eating grass. of course, you'll see lambs starting to eat grass at 2 or 3 weeks of age, but they can't actually utilise that grass until their rumen develops, which generally doesn't occur till lambs are about 4 to 6 weeks of age. So at around 4 to 6 weeks of age, the lambs will have been nibbling grass for a little while, but at that stage, they'll start to be able to utilise that grass. And what happens is that once you get past this lactation phase, I've got a black line here, hopefully you can see on the graph here, is the energy requirements of the lamb as it gets older, and the proportion of feed that the lamb is, or energy that the lamb is getting from the milk, starts to decrease. So at around peak lactation, just after peak lactation, around that 4 to 6 weeks, all the energy is still coming from the milk. But reasonably quickly, because the lamb is getting bigger and the milk supply is getting smaller, suddenly there's a very quick changeover from some of the nutrition coming from the grass to a lot of the nutrition coming from the grass. And in fact, most of the research, and it's quite hard research to conduct on lamb growth rates on ewes for a variety of reasons, but what it indicates is that the lambs seem to be able to continue while they're on their mothers at this 300 grams a day, provided the pasture quality is good, because as you can see from this black and white graph here, from some very old notes from Roy Kellaway, the amount of pasture that contributes to the growth of the lamb increases dramatically as you get further on from the 6 or 7 weeks, and starts to become a large proportion of the diet. So one of the key things to observe and to think about what's happening in the lambing paddock is to have a look at the distance the lamb is from the ewe. Now, in the photo down here, obviously, these are very young lambs. They haven't been marked yet. They're probably 2 or 3 weeks of age, and they're standing right near their mothers. Even the ones in the background that are sitting down are standing with their mothers. But as lambs begin to eat, they tend to drift further and further away, and often you will see lambs just before they're weaned, if you look in a paddock, and they'll be equally distributed across the paddock, ewes and lambs, and you won't even know which lamb belongs to which ewe. Obviously, if you go in and disturb them, they run back to their mums, but at the time, they're out grazing just as another sheep across the paddock, and they're attempting to compete with the ewe to get that grass. Now, the difficulty is that they are only lambs. They're having a good education from their mum, but they haven't yet learnt how to eat feed as efficiently as the ewe. So if the feed starts to be limiting, you can guarantee that the ewe is getting the best quality feed in the paddock, and the lamb is left with whatever's left. So that's a really important point to keep in mind as we go through here. So the key question is, when should I wean? So if the lambs and ewes are evenly spread across the paddock, if there's an even spread, then it suggests that there are going to be lots of competition between the ewe and the lamb, with the ewe doing better. So if the lambs need better feed and you've got better feed available, that's the very first thing to say, I'm going to benefit, the sheep are going to benefit by me weaning those lambs, because you'll be able to get the lambs onto a paddock where they're not having to compete with feed for the better quality. The next thing is, on these lambing paddocks, they tend to be fairly heavily contaminated with worms. Now, for the first 8 to 10 weeks of a lamb's life, worms are rarely going to be having a problem. The vast majority of the nutrition they're getting is from the ewe. They're not really grazing. They can't pick up the worms from the udder. They can only get it when they start eating grass. But as their grass consumption increases, and you've got this heavily contaminated worm paddock, you can start to have worm problems. So if you're concerned about worm control in the lambs, that's another trigger for needing to wean. And if lambs are beginning to scour, in particular in southern Australia, that might be an indicator that worm control is suboptimal, and the lambs might need a drench, and getting them off their mothers onto a lower contaminated paddock is what's going to give you the best growth rates there. The third thing that's really important, and I think the major reason for wanting to wean lambs, is to look after the ewes. Now, from what I've said, the ewes are dropping down in milk production. They're out competing the lambs. Surely the ewes are doing well enough. But depending when you're lambing, but particularly when you're lambing in mid to late winter, the ewes, by the time you wean those ewes, if you're weaning them in November, those lambs, they're not going to have a lot of time and good nutrition to put weight on before you're joining them again in February. So any weight they put on is really important. Now, as soon as you wean the lambs, the ewes will stop trying to produce milk within about 72 hours. And once they stop producing milk, they can divert nutrients much more effectively into weight gain. Every kilogram that you can put on that ewe between when you wean her and when you put the rams out will result in 2% extra lambs next year. And it's very easy, by delaying weaning, thinking that everything's going all right, for those ewes to be 4 to 5 kilograms lighter than they would have been by weaning a couple of weeks earlier, and that would result in a 10% lower lambing percentage the following year. So the obvious thing that we need to do with weaning is to look after our lambs, to give the lambs better access to feed and possibly to give them better worm control. But equally important is to get the weight back on the ewes. And it's really important in your twin-bearing ewes because they will have milked. You've seen from those lactation curves, they're really trying to produce the milk, and your higher producing ewes will still be lactating. And so that's going to be really important in terms of getting the weight back on the ewes. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone, and you can see the importance of that. The other issue around when I should wean, what does actually weaning at 14 weeks or weaning at 12 weeks mean? Does it mean when the average age of the lamb is 12 weeks, or does it mean 12 weeks from the beginning of lambing? And how long are you joining for? Often if you're lambing in July, you will have been joining in February, obviously. You might have joined, you won't quite have got the full, ewes won't all be cycling, and you might actually be joining for 6 weeks to make sure the ram effect doesn't decrease your lambing percentage. So if you're joining for 6 weeks, that means you lamb for 7 weeks. At 12 weeks of age, the youngest lamb is 5 weeks, and 5 weeks is almost always too young to wean a lamb. So if you haven't got your ewes sorted into early and late lambers, you do need to watch that, and probably what some people do, most people don't. Some people take off the older lambs and do a split weaning. That's possible. It does make management a bit more complicated, but it's certainly effective. It's better than delaying everything too long so that the youngest lamb is up to around the 8 weeks mark, which is about the minimum that we really want them. Lambs will survive from about 6 weeks onwards, but we really like them to be about 8 weeks, and then they should be on to eating pasture and be able to survive and grow well, not just survive, but grow well eating pasture. So I guess that covers a lot of what we're going to do. So just to recap, and I'm conscious most of you wouldn't have been on the webinar last week, I'm guessing, but I went overtime last week and I'm making up by going under time this week. I'm sorry. But let's have a look at the answers then. When do ewes cease lactation? And the easy answer is when you wean them. If you don't wean them, they will stop over time, but almost always you'll want to wean them. And the reason I don't want to say when they're going to cease lactation is it depends on what their condition score was when they started milking and what the pasturability was. So if we go back to that graph that had the falling green line on it, as well as the red and blue line, sheep, there can be anywhere in between can be the lactation curves that sheep can have. So it's impossible to say when they cease lactation. They will, while the lamb is trying to suckle, they will try and produce some milk. And so probably more important is not when do they stop lactating, but when does the lamb have most of its nutrition coming from the grass rather than from the milk. And I think I did some sums, and I think I worked out, even with a crossbred ewe, that around about 95% of the lamb's nutrition is coming from the grass and only 5% from the prime lamb mother at 13 weeks of age. So you've got to have a pretty good reason to need to keep them together from that point onwards. Obviously, if you're going to market those lambs straight off their mums, it's nothing to do with nutrition. It's all to do with stress and grouping animals together. But the mere act of weaning lambs will cause the lambs a setback. So obviously, if you're trying to market those lambs straight off their mothers, you might leave them on until 14 or 15 weeks so that you don't get that setback. But if you're going to market your lambs 8, 10, 12 weeks post-weaning, then I'd be encouraging you to think about weaning probably whenever you are or earlier, and not delaying weaning. And so the actual date, 14 weeks from the commencement of lambing for a prime lamb flock, is a good starting point. You need to be earlier if it's a tough season, and you need to be earlier if something's gone wrong. And in a really good season, you can afford to be a little bit lax about it, because both the ewe and the lamb should still be doing well, provided worm control's been adequate. So the 14-week mark is a good idea for, obviously, for merinos. We pull that back a couple of weeks because their milk production isn't correct. But if you wean your lambs on your property every year, 14 weeks after the first lamb's born, in some years that'll be spot on. In other years, it will be the wrong time. So hopefully that's made that clear. So the three, I think the really important thing is to have a think about why you want to wean your lambs. And the reason is to get weight back on your ewes. So while those ewes are trying to milk, they won't be putting as much weight on for next year's lambing. So it's about investing in the next year's lambing, even though you're trying to look after this year's lambs. And then the second reason is that if you want those lambs to keep on growing, if pasture availability in the lambing paddock is starting to become limiting, those ewes will be the ones getting the better feed, which will help their weight gain, but their weight gain won't be as efficient because they're still trying to milk. So, and that milk is only providing a maximum of 10% and probably more like 5% of the nutrition to the lamb. So it's useful, but it's quite an expensive way of doing that, rather than allocating it specifically to the lambs and then letting the ewes dry up and start to put weight back on. And obviously the final factor is worm control. So Hilary, they're the only things I really want to cover tonight. I know that's fairly brief, but I think it's good just to focus on those things. But I'm particularly keen to answer questions, and I'm also aware that lots of people are from different areas and will have different constraints that they might want to raise. So I hope that's all right pulling up there. And that's just a bit of a promo one of my daughters did for Thank a Farmer. So I thought I'd better put that up while we ask questions.
Oh, that's fantastic. Great. Thank you for that. That's a wonderful photo. Well, thanks very much, Bruce. And I think that irrelevant of time, I think it was a very clear and succinct presentation, and I certainly took away some key points which were probably sometimes a bit muddled in other information we might be fed from other sources. So it's good to get back to just the basics and put them into practice. I'll just give Bruce a bit of a break for a second. If you do have to head off, then you will exit the webinar and you will be presented with a survey. Could you please take a few minutes to do the survey? It provides feedback for us at Homesack, at MLA, and the presenters like Bruce, just to make sure the webinars are hitting the right spots. And again, these webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. They should be up within a day or two on the MLA website. All right, we'll get into some questions. There's a few coming through, so that's great. And everyone's saying thanks, Bruce. Great presentation. I have a question to start, and I think you've pretty much answered it, Bruce, by saying that at a certain point or beyond 13 weeks, the intake or the nutritional value from milk is what, 95% or 5% compared to 95% from the pasture. So in your graphs that you started with, it looks like the ME from the milk gets to about, I think it was 3 or 4 ME. So if you are weaning at a later date and they still are intaking milk with a lower ME, will that affect their growth rate? Because it's, I guess.
So that's a bit of a confusing graph, and thanks for pointing that out. The ME of the milk, the energy density of the milk stays the same the whole time. It's just the amount of milk being produced falls. So the total amount of energy the lamb's getting from the ewe is lower, but the quality of the milk is the same virtually the whole way through lactation. So it's really, there's been some excellent work done looking at the growth rates of lambs in different stages during lactation. But what it shows is that it's the quality of the pasture in the second half of lactation. So from about 6 to 7 weeks onwards, the growth rates of the lambs is determined by the quality of the pasture, not so much by the milk production of the ewe. And controlling for that in an experiment gets very, very difficult. So that's why there's relatively little data on all of this, but it certainly indicates that provided you've got good quality pasture, the lambs will still grow exceptionally well up to about 13 or 14 weeks, but they're doing that because of the pasture, not because of the milk.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce. Sorry about my roundabout question there. So the first one from one of our participants tonight, what is your opinion on leaving replacement ewes with their mothers, except for the period of rejoining, so then they can acquire the accumulated knowledge which is contained within the flock? This person has explored the idea with Professor Fred Provenza, I'm not sure if you're aware, and he suggests that this course has merit and can advantage the young stock as they grow. That certainly has merit, and it has merit from a bacteriological point of view in terms of sharing of bacteria for breaking down grass and those sort of things. Interestingly, Susan Robertson did some trial work at CSU where maiden ewes were kept with older ewes with the belief that the older ewes would teach the maiden ewes how to be better mums, and it turned out to be the opposite. The maiden ewes had a worse lambing when they were kept with the older ewes. So I think even while things are very logical, without the evidence, it's hard to say whether that's going to be a useful thing. And the other thing that you do have to watch is that things like worm control and management of younger versus older sheep sometimes needs a different perspective. Certainly at joining time, and without the question in front of me, I haven't quite got the time frame that we're separating and putting them together, but certainly at joining time, it's very important that younger ewes are not joined with older ewes. The reason being that the younger ewes are only on heat for a very short period of time, whereas older ewes are on heat for almost double the period of time, and they tend to occupy the ram for a lot longer period. And so if younger ewes are joined with older ewes, the older ewes have a very good joining percentage, but the younger ewes don't. If you put the younger ewes all together and put rams out, then the ewes are cycling, they're on, they're off, the rams are going between the younger ewes, if that all makes sense. Great, thank you for the question. Good one to start off with. The next one, do breeds, or what's your opinion on infusing breeds like, I think it's Awassi, to promote higher milk yields?
Yeah, I guess that all comes down to your system. There's been certainly infusion of East Friesians and those sort of things to increase milk. As far as I'm aware, each breed has some advantages and then some disadvantages, and I don't think anyone's quite worked out the best way of infusing different breeds in and not taking some of the disadvantages. So it's really horses for courses, and it's what suits your system. If you're happy with the different things that come along with it, potentially differences in growth rate and muscle composition, then what you gain in one area, you potentially lose in another area. If you're happy with that compromise, then it's certainly a good option.
Excellent. The next one, if we're slaughtering sucker lambs, at what age would yield start to drop?
Yield of sucker lambs, as opposed to, so we really need, I don't know if Sean McGrath's on here. I work with Sean. That's probably a really good topic for a webinar, actually. That's a great question. I think what the question is about the yield starting to decrease on the lambs when they're being killed from starting to put fat deposition down. Do you think that's what the question is?
I would think so, but Steve, if you would just like to clarify.
That's a really good question, and Sean's done a fair bit of work with that. And we've actually got a PhD student, Tom Keogh, who's doing some work around this at the moment. So that might be something specifically in terms of weaning lambs. It's well past the point that we would be thinking about whether or not we should have weaned the lambs. So I haven't really got the data with me on that for this webinar.
Okay, well, that might be one we look into. Thanks for the question, Steve. And he did clarify that that's where he's coming from.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I'd probably, I might get it wrong if I try and paraphrase what Sean and Tom are doing. So I'll just sit out on that one at the moment. Is that quibbing out too much?
No, not at all.
Squibbing out. Okay.
Okay, the next one, this isn't overly clear, but you might be able to make sense of it, Bruce. Someone's written, I missed what the number of weeks for a merino were to the equivalent of the 14 weeks for a prime lamb.
Yeah. Yep. Great question. So there's about a 2-week advantage in the prime lamb at any one point for the same amount of nutrition. So where the merinos we'd be saying about 12 weeks you ought to be looking at weaning, you're pretty comfortable under the same nutrition condition score type scenarios to be going out to 14 weeks in the prime lambs. So it's around about a 2-week difference. But if you've got a really tough year, the prime lambs might make it out to 11 or 12 weeks. The merinos will be struggling at probably 9 or 10 weeks under those same conditions. And that's just from those graphs I showed, the relative difference in milk production between the prime lamb mum or composites will have potentially slightly more again.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question. The next one from Hannah. Any statistics on triplets? Do triplet lambs get even less milk per head? And are you better off removing one lamb?
Well, the answer to the first one's really easy. Yes, the triplets get more. So the ewe produces more milk again. Her intake goes up slightly more, but it's even relatively less. So it was about 70% that the milk increased and the intake increased by about 60% with a twin, with a relative to the single. Instead of doubling, it only went up to about 1.6. With the triplet, it should go up to 3, and it's well and truly under the 2.2 mark, so it hasn't gone up nearly as much. So the second question, are you better? It just depends on what labour ability and how successful you are at cross-mothering and all those things. I mean, in the end, ewes surprisingly look after triplets reasonably well. If those triplets survive, most of them work reasonably well. I know a couple of producers that take out their triplets, have a lot of triplets and manage them separately. And I guess it's whatever course suits your management system. as well. But the ewe will certainly look after her, but the lambs won't grow as quickly.
Right, thank you. The next one from Scott, is it worth adding in self-feeders at 7 weeks to start imprint feeding and development of the lamb's rumen?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think we've probably come up with a really good webinar here because I know Tom Keogh, our PhD student, actually did exactly that trial as one of his first trials in his PhD to have a look. And the results are equivocal about this at the moment, is my understanding, but I shouldn't be talking on Tom's behalf. I guess the logical thing is, yes, it is. It just depends on what you're doing with those lambs subsequently. The important thing is that when you've got high quality feeds, substitution becomes a very important part, and you can spend a lot of money on supplements to then have those lambs wasting or eating the supplements and not utilizing the grass. The imprint feeding really only needs to be done at just prior to when you're going to be getting them onto the feed, is my understanding, around about 1 to 2 weeks beforehand, which would be a fair bit later. But again, it depends. If you're lambing relatively late in your season, and by 7 or 8 weeks the pastures are starting to dry off and you're going to have them on supplement feed, then having some feeders out in the paddock is very good. But again, that would probably fit in with something that Tom would be able to talk about much better than I could.
Well, fantastic. Tom, I hope you're on because you've got a few webinars to talk about. I used to live with Tom, so I'm sure we'll be cringing. All right, the next one, Bruce, how would you temper your advice for graziers raising Dorpers or Australian whites with no wool nutrition required?
Yeah, I guess the same two things. I don't have any experience, and unfortunately I can find very little data, and most of what I've talked about tonight is from research done with first cross ewes as the mothers, and I haven't got a lot of data on Dorpers or on even composites to really be confident about what I'm saying. But if you take out the wool production, which is only one part of it, the two things hold very true across all the species that we deal with, and that is that reproduction efficiency is related to body condition at the time that joining occurs. So whatever you need to do to get condition back on those animals becomes fairly important. And even though things like Dorpers always look under dry conditions as though they're doing very well, they will still be responding in terms of body weight. I'm very confident about that. So there's still going to be an advantage. And the other thing is that the milk is still going to follow that same curve. Whether the curve's exactly the same or a bit longer, that I don't know. But what I do know is that almost certainly the behaviour of those sheep will be telling you what's going on in those paddocks. And certainly as the lamb strays further and further, what it's telling you is I'm getting most of my nutrition from the grass. If the lamb is staying very close to the mother, it doesn't need to be going out and looking for feed. Now, I'm not talking about the lamb groups at 3 or 4 weeks of age running around the paddock having their races from their mum and everything. They're not out grazing. What I'm talking about is going down to the paddock at 9 or 10 in the morning and looking across the paddock, and they're evenly distributed across the paddock grazing. That really indicates very little of the nutrition is coming from the milk. So I'm guessing in the absence of really good scientific data, using that sort of information from your own observations will give you the best way of modifying weaning in those systems.
Great, thank you. And the next question from Anne, I think you pretty much already touched on, but you might be able to expand on the concept. Is there a role for creep feeding?
Yeah, look, there is definitely a potential role for creep feeding, but to describe, I haven't done enough work with creep feeding to describe the situation. That if you're likely to be feeding heavily with supplements subsequent to weaning, then creep feeding's likely to be highly beneficial. But remember that substitution occurs when you have access to 2 or 3 high quality feeds. So it means that your cheaper pasture, which could be growing the lambs at 280 or 300 grams a day while they're grazing on their mums, is being substituted by the more expensive feed and not necessarily getting you the growth rates. But we're very interested in that idea, and that's why Tom did that as part of his first experiment, was actually to look at animals that had access to creep feeding, and he included both hay and a grain-based one versus not having, just being out in the paddock. And I think from memory, it probably took about 10 to 12 days for those lambs really to start getting onto the feed. And from there on, they certainly consumed the feed. But the difference wasn't as spectacular as we expected. But Tom's investigating that further because we think there might have been some other things going on. So I'm really only telling a bit of the story at the moment, and that's because I know more of the story will be coming at some point.
All right, great. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Anne. The next one from Tim. Great presentation. Thank you, Bruce. Have you got any lamb growth data post-weaning for 8 weeks of age versus 14 weeks of age of the lamb?
No, I haven't. I had a meeting with Tom and Sean and Hut Noddy today, and we were just talking about almost getting that exact data set, except we're trying to get 10 weeks apart. So, no, we don't. There have been several trials that have been done looking at exactly that, and they're conflicting information. But just come back to first principles for a moment. The reason you would be weaning at 8 weeks of age when the majority of lambs are around about 10 to 6 weeks of age, let's say, is in a really tough season. And this is one of the problems, is that getting data on that versus 14 weeks is a normal one. In a tough season, the ewes won't be milking sufficiently out to 14 weeks. So comparing like situations, I can almost guarantee you that if the lambs are weaned at 8 weeks of age versus 14 weeks of age, there will be an advantage in the 14-week-old lambs under ideal conditions. But under tough conditions, the 8-week-old lamb is almost certainly going to be equal to or better than the 14-week-old lamb, because the 14-week-old lamb will have taken a bit more of a beating in those tough conditions, if that makes any sense. So I'm not sure whether you can see where I'm coming from there, but it's going across different seasons under different scenarios. You've got to do it all within the one, and then that's not usually the condition that you'd apply both those scenarios to.
No,
I'm not sure I explained that very well, Hilary, but
if you need clarification, let us know. But it was fine for me, Bruce. Tim's just got one more question. Any advice on weaning strategy for ewe lambs that have lambed?
Good point. That is a really good point. And I didn't pick up on that, and I probably should have. I'm sorry that question's come as a few people have left, but that is a fantastic question. 2 things about ewe lambs that I should definitely have pointed out. Ewe lambs won't milk as well as adult sheep, and so their lactation curve is not going to peak as much, and lambs are going to need to be weaned earlier. The other thing is that those ewe lambs are still going to be growing, and getting the weight back on them will get you the biggest response in terms of dollar input in next year's lambing. So I was going to mention, but it gets so complicated because it all depends on the feed availability. I was going to mention that you probably need to be thinking about weaning twin lambing mobs a bit earlier than single lambing mobs, but then most people put their twin lambers on the better feed, and that doesn't hold true. With these ewe lambs, they're often almost always given the very best feed, which they need, but you still should be looking at weaning those early for the sake simply of the ewe lambs, not of the lambs of the ewe lambs.
Yep, good point. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much for raising that. That was an oversight of mine.
No worries. The next one from Toby. Given the prices on average are 10% better in July and August than November and December, do you think superior weight gains of weaned lambs in spring are worth chasing despite the lower prices at market?
$1 million question, isn't it? I mean, if I could tell you that answer, it'd be so easy, wouldn't it? I mean, the market premiums keep on changing around, and market premiums exist because people have an extra cost to produce those animals, and not everyone can produce animals at the time. The biggest issue about producing lambs at different times, in my view, is the number of ewes that you can effectively run on your property. And if by lambing earlier and chasing a premium and getting a higher price per head results in you only producing 2/3 the number of lambs, then you get a bit of a saving in, running 2/3 number of ewes and therefore even less than 2/3 the number of lambs. You get a little bit of saving in costs, but your gross income goes down quite a bit. So it's this absolute conundrum between the stocking rate and the price, and it's usually why the price premium is the way it is, because most people have done the sums and worked out that getting slightly less per head but producing more lambs is still worthwhile. If that wasn't the case, a lot of people would be lambing earlier, the price premiums would disappear and they'd probably reappear for later on. So it really is quite a complex issue. And it does change as prices change, so there's no set rule. But the slight complication with sheep, is that as you pull lambing back earlier in the year, you pull joining back, and because sheep are short day breeders, the number of lambs that you produce may decrease. It gets slightly harder. Now, the question I haven't been asked, but goes right to the heart of this, is, am I better producing a single lamb or twin lambs? How productive are they? Obviously, a ewe that produces twin lambs will produce more income for you than a ewe that produces a single lamb. But if you have 100 ewes producing twin lambs, you'll have a higher losses in your twins. There'll be more inefficiency and so on and so forth. So it's all around that same issue. And when I've done the sums on singles and twins, it comes out about the same. And when I've done the sums on the earlier lambing with the price premium, I'm still behind a little bit because of stocking rate. Now, if you're not chasing stocking rate or you're keeping your ewe numbers the same, then the premium becomes more valuable. That's a very long answer, but it was a great question.
Well answered, Bruce. Thank you. I don't think you've touched on this one. Excuse me if you have. Just could you give us an age on when it is beneficial to start imprint feeding?
Yeah, look, the age for imprint feeding is once the lambs are consuming grass so that they've developed a rumen. So any time from that point onwards, you can imprint feed. The imprint feeding is the ewes teaching the lambs to look for the feed on the ground and then tasting it. The lambs don't actually need to consume a lot of the feed. They need to learn that that is feed that they can then eat. So it's not adjusting their gut to it at all. It is them getting the idea for it. But if they're not used to going out and looking for feed, then they won't be very good at it. So generally we say any time from around about 10 weeks onwards. Of course, you get away with it if you do it at almost any time, because there are some lambs, we talk about this age and we're focusing here on age, but what we're ignoring is the fact that there is a large range. And for most people, there are a few people that probably lamb over or join for 3 to 4 weeks and lamb over 4 to 5, but most of us join for 5 to 6 weeks and lamb over 6 to 8 weeks. And so we've got a range of age of lambs. Now, what happens is you'll be saying, oh, yes, I started imprint feeding at 10 or 11 weeks of age. There must have been some of them at 4 or 5, so that must be wrong. Luckily, you don't have to have every animal aware of what's happening, because the rest of them that have learnt teach the others very, very quickly. So that's why you get away with only 2 or 3 feeds. on our place, I try and do 5 feeds before I wean lambs that I know I'm going to have to feed over the summer, just because I like it to be much smoother when I go in. But certainly 3 feeds is shown to be pretty effective.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. The next one from Stephen, what are your thoughts on weaning lambs on weight instead of age?
Yeah, so that looks after the mother. That looks after the lamb, and weaning lambs. I mean, essentially, you can't wean lambs on age. You can either wean lambs at a time relative to that when lambing started in the mob, but you don't actually know the age. The only thing you know about the animal is the weight, which is a really good proxy for weaning on age of the specific lamb. And that's what I was suggesting in the presentation, that if lambing is spread or you're under a bit of pressure, you can certainly decrease that by taking off the older, i.e. the heavier lambs early on, and that works well. But again, you've still got to have a look. The advantage of that will be minimal if they're on really good feed and you've got good worm control. The advantage of doing that for the extra labour will be relatively minimal. But in tighter seasons, that's when you need to be on the ball with weaning, and that sort of strategy can work really well.
Great, thank you. So the next one from Steve. If the 3 main factors are not an issue and feed is plentiful, what are your thoughts on leaving unweaned beyond 14 weeks to get lambs to a slaughter weight? Is it possible to quantify the setback from weaning, i.e. will lambs lose weight / go sideways for a period if feed is plentiful? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Steve. I tried to look that up and I couldn't get good data on what the loss of weaning was. So I'm really going off my own experience, and that is, despite doing what I think is the optimal, getting lambs in reasonably small mobs, getting them back onto a paddock very quickly, I still see the activity of those lambs in the next 48 hours, walking around the fences, not sitting out and grazing as they were with their mothers, learning how to interact with all the peers that they're now in, and that must result in, and it certainly does in terms of visual appearance of the lamb, that they don't seem to be doing as well. So I have no problems at all with delaying weaning for the reasons that you've outlined under those conditions, although I would always say there's almost always a penalty in the subsequent lamb percentage that you're going to get, because while the lambs are on the ewes, and I'd say, as far as if we really set a date and pushed me, I'd say up to 20 weeks, those ewes are still attempting to milk, and as a result, they won't be quite as heavy at the next joining. But you could argue, and you wouldn't be far off, that if feed's plentiful, then they will still be doing pretty well, and it's probably not an issue. Again, with almost all things with sheep management, things work well in a really good season, apart from a few health issues, but in terms of nutrition and production, they work really well. It's in the tighter seasons that we really have to be on the ball for what's happening.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Steve, for the question. The next one from Richard. Are you better off keeping lambs on pasture once weaned for a period of time, or can they go straight into a feedlot?
They can go straight into a feedlot if they've been properly prepared to go into that feedlot. The reason that you keep them on pasture is only one based on economics, not on feed conversion. Interestingly, and probably as a complete aside, I had a look at some lambing operations last year in Canada, and 3 of the operations I went to, the sheep were kept indoors on one of them all year round up until slaughter at 50 kilograms. And on the other 2, they virtually had no access to pasture, and those lambs went off milk, had creep feeding while they were on milk, and then went straight on to 70% some sort of high grain type diet. A lot of it was corn, some of it was rolled, some of it was roasted. And those lambs, their growth rates and feed conversion efficiencies were very high. So the sheep can cope with that no problems. It's just one simply of economics. I mean, if you can go grow animals out on grass, you're usually a long way ahead.
All right. Thank you for the question. There is still a few coming in, Bruce, so it's not going to be any less than the other night. All right, the next one from George. Any tips on reducing weaning stress on lambs to inhibit weight loss, to stop weight loss at a weaning?
Yeah, look. The only tip I can give you is to not have those lambs locked up for too long. But the stress, most of the stress on lambs at weaning is self-imposed by those lambs understanding the new system that they're coming in. And look, it's exactly the same. I hate taking examples of people, but it really is the same as kids going off to school or to boarding school or any of these things. It is a shock to the system for the lambs, and they do take a minute to adjust. And you will be surprised at how much animal-to-animal interaction has to do with the health and welfare of animals. And so we think they're all sitting out there happily in the paddock, but there is a bit of, bullying and pecking order being sorted out when you change groups of animals at any stage. And I've always thought that's pretty minor with sheep, but the research I've seen on some of this in individual sheep suggests that it certainly has a role. And I can only think that that's part of why we see this weaning stress. So, I mean, the obvious things is to try and do it when the weather's most favourable and put them onto a decent paddock. But look, I do all these things. I wean lambs onto what I think are fantastic paddocks, and I can still guarantee you that the first 24 hours they seem to walk around the paddock. They don't go out and eat, whereas 2 or 3 days later, they're starting to settle down and grazing again. So they've got to take a bit of a setback at that stage.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. The next one from Matt. Please describe how the RAM effect works and what type of reduction in conception rates could you expect if you get it wrong?
Yeah. Okay. So the RAM effect is very simple, and it occurs irrespective of whether you use teasers or not. The reason that you use teasers is just to help with your management. But the RAM effect occurs by putting rams out or by using teasers. And once you understand it, then you can work your management around it. So what happens is, provided ewes haven't been continuously exposed to rams, the exposure to the pheromones of those rams, their smells, starts the ewe's breeding system going. And what happens is all those ewes, 48 hours after they've had exposure, have a silent heat. And that's fine. The rams don't know about it. There's no mating activity. They ovulate. 50% of the ewes that have had that silent heat go on to have a normal cycle. So it starts them, and they have a 17-day cycle. So at day 19, they're ready to accept the ram. The other 50% of the ewes, that first silent heat doesn't seem to be enough to get their breeding system going, and they have a second silent heat 6 days later. So that's now day 8 after the rams are introduced. They then go on, provided that it's had the right effect, they then go on to have a 17-day cycle. And so you get these two peaks of activity, 19 and 25 days after the introductions of rams or teasers. If you haven't used teasers and you put rams in, the effect of that is that when lambing starts, you usually get a dribble of lambs of those ewes that were already in season, and there's always the odd ewe that is. And then around 17, 18, 19, because ewes don't lamb on exactly the right day, just as people don't have babies all on the one day. Over that, around about that 19-day mark, you get one peak of lambs, and then around about a week later, you get this second peak of lambs. So what the recommendation is, if you want to tighten up your lambing to have the nutrition right for the ewes at the time and not have this dribble of sheep, is if you have testosterone-treated wethers, you put them in for 14, absolute maximum of 16 days, and then introduce the rams. You will stop that dribble of lambs in the first 16 or 15 days before lambing starts. So it's really, it doesn't alter the fertility of the sheep because the effect happens whether or not you put the rams or the teasers in. It's only a management thing. Hopefully I've made that nice and clear so we're not affecting it. What I was talking about was I did mention it, and I might have implied that you get a lowering with the ram effect. You certainly don't get any difference in fertility one way or the other. The important thing is to think about your ram percentage. It just means that your rams need to be at the top of the game at that time that 50% of the ewes are all coming in over a 2 or 3 day period, rather than, as would normally happen, 6% of ewes would normally, around about 6% would be cycling each day. So we generally find that if you're lambing earlier and you're getting a teasing effect, your ram numbers need to be up a little bit compared with later on in the joining. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. That was a really good description. I'm sure Matt got his question answered there. All right, the next one I think is pretty straightforward. How would you manage weaning within a lambing flock if a percentage of the ewes have lost condition due to feet problems or metabolic disorders throughout lambing? So there's lambs intermingled that aren't getting milk off unhealthy ewes, but others that are still getting lots of milk from healthy ewes.
So look, in that thing, I think it's reasonably straightforward. It's really just getting a matter of getting those ewes and lambs in and drafting off the lambs that are obviously being affected and the lighter ewes. Those ewes will be struggling under those conditions. They're not providing any to the lambs. The lambs will be better off out of that system and looked after specifically. So it's really a matter of just using the drafting gate and taking them off. And getting them off as soon as possible. Remember that green line that I had that went straight down, a bit of a depressing line compared with the blue and red lines that had a nice little peak and it went down again. You end up producing very little milk, and you will lose lambs if the ewes aren't milking. And that is just one other thing, and I didn't think it fitted in under prime lambs because we rarely run prime lambs under these conditions, but you have to be a little bit careful if you're drought feeding ewes and they're milking, that you have a sufficient fibre. Feeding wheat alone tends to put weight on the ewes and they stop milking because there's not enough fibre to allow the milk to be produced. But I'm straying well from either the question or the topic, so I just mentioned that as a throwaway.
All right, thank you, Bruce. Okay, the next one from Scott. What supplementary feed do lambs do best on with their rumen at 10 to 12 weeks of age?
They do best on the supplementary feed that has the highest protein and energy levels. So they can cope at 10 to 12 weeks of age with any feed, which is pretty surprising. And it really just depends on getting the energy. On the younger a lamb is, the higher the energy, the protein requirement is. They all have a very high energy requirement, but they also have a high protein requirement. And so keeping the protein levels up and the energy levels up is the best feed. So things like lupins they can cope with, but it's a bit hard to get hold of them now. But they can actually cope with anything at that stage. Earlier on, it's whatever they're being exposed to, they will adapt to it. But by 10 to 12 weeks of age, they should be able to adapt to almost anything.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next one from David. Best practice drenching is to first drench lambs at 12 weeks after the start of lambing. If weaning at 14 weeks, should we drench again or delay the first drench to weaning?
Delay the first drench. And the reason you've delayed weaning to 14 weeks is that you're on good pastures, the lambs are doing well, and because the ewes are milking really well, they haven't picked up as many worms. The idea of needing to drench weaners, which is a very good recommendation, at 12 weeks of age at weaning comes from merino ewes, which don't milk as well. Lambs only pick up worms once they're not, the ewe starts to decrease in milk production and the rumen develops. They've got to have a developed rumen for the worm to be able to get established. So for most lambs, that's going to start from about 7 to 8 weeks. But of course, if the milk production's slightly better as it is in prime lambs, that's going to be a couple of weeks later. So you're pretty comfortable with that, albeit you will get the odd lamb that does have a few worms in it because its mother stopped milking and it's eating, and you all will have seen those lambs. If you're handling them, you can give that individual a drench. But in terms of the whole mob, you'd be hanging off, or you'd make the decision because they're wormy, you need to drench earlier. Drenching sheep only turns the lambs inside out if they're wormy. It doesn't make any difference unless, of course, you've got a selenium deficiency and you're giving selenium with the drench. But drenching as such is only if they've got worms, and they're only going to have worms if you're having a tough season or the ewes aren't milking. So again, that idea of looking at the lambs and seeing whether they're close to their mums, which indicate they're milking well, visually seeing the udders of the ewes will give you a good idea that those lambs are still primarily getting a lot of nutrition from the milk. And as that gets older, you'll soon see if the lambs are going off.
Thank you. All right, we'll try and speed through the last of them. Bruce, what are your thoughts on yard weaning?
Yard weaning, I don't really have any thoughts on yard weaning in sheep. I mean, there's not, for most people I see, weaning isn't a major hassle in terms of fencing. Probably some people laughing at me about that. I mean, the only reason to yard wean is really to allow the lambs to settle down. If you're going into a drought situation, yard weaning's got a big role to play. But if you're in the paddock situation, then you can do almost everything you need to do with imprint feeding, plus or minus some sort of creep feeding system, without necessarily needing to yard wean. I have been involved with a couple of trials with yard weaning, and it works surprisingly well, and the lambs adapt to the feed very quickly. But I guess it depends on what system you need. Sort of the focus of this was really on when to be doing that, not how to be doing it, but certainly it can be done, but I don't have a lot of experience with it.
Okay, great. The next one from James. You mentioned all sheep are seasonal breeders. The Aussie Whites appear to be marketed as truly non-seasonal. What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, okay. So I mean, Merinos are potentially non-seasonal as well, but we still see an effect, and often we see the effect as much in the rams as we do in the ewes. So if you look at testicular tone, if you palpate rams in, say, in another month's time, or July or August, it'll give you a pretty good idea of whether those sheep are seasonal breeders or not. It's certainly a bit of an eye-opener when you do that and you think that they're doing it. The fact that a ewe can breed all year round does not make her a non-seasonal breeder if she then responds in ovulation rate to shortening day length. So my understanding is that even though they will breed all year round, they are more fertile, rams are more fertile, and they have higher ovulation rates as day length shortens. But I might be wrong on that, and I don't have any specific data on that breed.
Okay. The next one has been asked twice, so I'll give it to you, Bruce. At what age would you suggest weaning hand-reared orphan lambs which have had access to ad-lib milk and ad-lib access to pellets?
As soon as possible, unless it's a potty lamb, and then you're never going to be allowed to stop, are you?
No.
So, I mean, if you back it, I mean, look, the rule of thumb here is that you need to be offering these lambs from around about 2 to 3 weeks of age access to the sort of feeds that they're going to be on. And once they start getting onto those feeds and their rumen develops, their rumen will still take the 3 to 4 weeks to develop. Surprisingly, even though they're orphan and they're not in with other sheep, they seem to be able to develop and get all the right bacteria, even in the backyard or in a pen or anywhere else. So we're looking at around 6 to 7 weeks of age. Lambs shouldn't need to be hand-fed after that. My kids and my wife disagree strongly with me on that. So, and I don't often win. So we feed lambs here for a lot longer if we happen to have a potty. But that's what the science says.
You have girls, don't you, Bruce?
I have boys and girls, but the girls always seem to be the ones looking after the lambs.
All right, three more. The next one from Nick. Can wether lambs be used as with the same level of efficacy as older wethers being used as teasers?
Yeah, good question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't think I've ever thought about it. Logically, they should respond to testosterone the same. It is a pheromone effect, not a physical effect. So provided they're producing the pheromones, I wouldn't see that there's any problems at all. But I don't actually know that. I'll have to look that up. That's a great question.
Good question, Nick. All right, from Peter, what is your view on using pellets for rumen development if trying to go for 3 lambings over a 2-year period?
So that's giving pellets to the lambs to try and wean the lambs as early as possible so that you can get through. I mean, the thing I haven't discussed at all tonight is this lactational anestrus, which is an important part of the ewe reproductive system, only because I'm assuming that we're in a sort of a normal system where there's plenty of time between weaning and joining again. But what you've got to do there is, and it just comes straight back to economics. I've looked at this a couple of times. I have trouble to make it work. Despite on paper it looks really good. When it seems to go into practice, one of the 3 joinings every 2 years seems not as good as the other ones. And if your budget copes with that and it still looks good, and I haven't done it with current lamb prices, it may well be a winner. It specifically in terms of the pellets, there's no problems at all. It's a great option for getting lambs onto pellets. But as I've said before, it doesn't actually matter what the feed is, so long as it's high quality feed, the lambs will do well. The critical thing is getting those ewes back out of lactation, and there will be a cost to that if you're trying to do it too early. So it's really a matter of sitting down and having a look at it. I've certainly done that for a couple of clients, but when I've seen it in practice, it's never worked as well as we've predicted. So take that just as a warning and prove me wrong, please.
No, I think I've looked at it a few times, Bruce, and I think you hit the nail on the head. All right, last question for this evening from Melanie. Sorry to make you repeat, but how long after weaning do you recommend the sale of lambs?
I didn't repeat. That's not asking me to repeat. I haven't answered that question. And given it's the last question, I'll just pretend I've dropped out and you can't hear me. Look, I don't recommend that any time the sale of lambs. That depends on your system and what you want to do and what you believe the market's going to do and everything else. I'm not in the business of predicting markets, and I'm only a producer like you guys. I've got no better insight to that. I market my lambs for a completely different reason on production, something to do with my management strategy straight off their mothers. But the economics will say that you should be able to grow them out more effectively. But again, it depends on your pasture supply and what other priorities you have both on your farm and in your life. So I'm really sorry, I'm not going to answer that question. It's a great question, but there isn't a scientific answer to that. It depends on what you're doing, the type of sheep you have, what market you're aiming for, and what the price premiums are doing. I'm guessing somebody like my not too far away colleague Tom Bull or somebody might have very specific things on that, but from a scientific point of view, it's really there isn't a correct answer to that.
Yeah, I think the question probably was more targeted at you. I think she might have missed when you said that you can sell straight off mum.
Yeah. So, and I guess if you think about selling straight off mum, don't be too keen about weaning the sheep and have that as part of your system, because you may well, and I mean, what I do is I draft the lambs off their mother in drafts and leave the rest of them on. So leave the rest of the lambs on. So, I'll start off with a mob of 350 ewes. There might be 450 lambs in there. I might have taken off 200 lambs, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, I'll take the other lambs off if I'm going straight off the mother. So that's because as somebody previously asked, should we be doing it on age or weight? Weight is the proxy for age, and I'm really just taking them at a similar age and making up for the fact that not everything lambed down in the first week or 10 days.
Wonderful. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your questions, and we made up for your
fantastic questions as always. I just love the questions. They're absolutely brilliant.
That's really good to hear, Bruce, because we were at it for a while. We made up for your short presentation, so I'm glad you did that. All right. Well, thank you again very much, Bruce, for the presentation and for staying on for the question time. Thank you for everyone for participating, and have a good evening.
And don't forget your survey. You forgot to say, Hillary. Thanks, Hillary. That was great.
Please don't forget the survey. Thank you, Bruce. We'll have you on again.
Okay. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.